What actually took place at the 1847 Easter feast? What caused a mute servant to strike in God's house? And how could a woman disappear without being noticed but never really go? This is not merely a blood story. It's a name no one dares mention out loud, a whisper buried in South Carolina soil. Rebecca was who? What did she recall that people were trying to forget? If you wish to adhere to authentic, to ensure you don't miss any of our investigations, subscribe to the channel right now and enable notifications. We tell stories that defy time and uncover hidden realities. On April 4th, 1847, the morning had begun with the odd silence that frequently comes before major upheavals. The village of Ashmore got ready for Easter in the low area of South Carolina, where the soil remembered too much and the magnolia trees swayed heavily with the promise of rain. At the edge of the meadows, the church stood plain and weathered, its bell not yet ringing and its white paint already flaking in the sea breeze. Rung. Inside, hymn books were open in pews that had been blackened by generations of fingers, and candles had been lit with devotion. With overseers with sunburned faces, planters and their families dressed in ironed linen, and a few house slaves allowed to sit in the rear with their heads down and their eyes elsewhere, the crowd arrived, as though called by an invisible hand. Rebecca stood out for her quiet among the folding tables outdoors and the attendants who moved stealthily beneath the altar. A 20-something woman with minor kitchen scars on her hand's knife, and even though her outfit was immaculate, it had been repaired too many times to hide its deterioration. Rebecca was the property of Mr. William C. Dawes, a man of virtue and property who was well known in the area for his order more than his benevolence. Rebecca had complied with his insistence that she serve at the Easter lunch at the church feast. Nothing about her thoughts was visible through the plain kerchief that framed her face. She passed through like vapor. The undetected but present preparations. The Easter sermon sounded like it would burst from the pulpit. The pastor discussed sin, temporal and spiritual bonds, the Lamb's blood, and the hope of salvation. His voice reverberated, occasionally muttering, occasionally shattering, until the air seemed heavy with something other than incense. Some claimed that during the sermon Rebecca never looked up. Others said she recited silently, her mouth moving. Later, nobody could agree on what they had actually witnessed. Following the preaching, tables were arranged under the oaks, wine was served, bread was broken, and laughter was shared as the congregation dispersed into the warm afternoon. Rebecca offered ham pieces, poured glasses, and nodded when someone spoke to her. Mr. Dawes was seated at the head of a long table, his hand lingering on her arm for longer than necessary at times as he laughed too loudly. Most didn't notice, but some did. Around 4 as the day's second hymn started in the background, like a razor through cotton, a scream sliced through the crowd. One of the mill owner's daughters had noticed the blood before Rebecca did, and it was she who yelled. Mr. Dawes lay on the ground, his fingers pulsating blood as he clutched at his throat. Rebecca was standing over him, silent and not running. Something metallic caught the sun for a moment in her hand. Chaos broke out in the churchyard. Men yelled, children and skirts were gathered by women. There was a shout to halt her, but Rebecca remained motionless. She kept her gaze on Dawes' face while he gasped for air. Later, no one would remember her face. Some claimed it was calm. Others described it as mournful or blank. Long after the feast had devolved into a terrifying scene, the sun had set, and Rebecca had left by the time the bell rung. She was nowhere to be found in the church, the pine forest beyond the field, or the muddy path that went to the river. Torches were lighted, dogs were brought and then discarded, and the field shook as a chorus of accusatory rather than urgent voices called her name. As though consumed by the very earth she had tilled, Rebecca had disappeared. Blood and a quiet that no preaching could sanctify were all that were left. When nightfall arrived, Mr. Dawes was lying in the church's chilly cellar, covered in rough linen, a layer of dried blood, and a sealing the cut on his throat. The late-called doctor murmured something that no one recorded. Without hesitation, the blade had found the artery cleanly. This truth persisted in a single, incisive, and determined motion that was impossible to be coincidental. The voices in the town were lowered. No one could remember, not even his wife, who had not gone to the feast with him. Some whispered of long-buried vengeance, while others claimed a sudden lunacy. A brief moment in which Rebecca had defiantly lifted her hand, voice, or even her gaze. As if composed of fog, she had always complied and vanished into the job. When cleaning the silver, a deacon recalled witnessing her hands shake. Another remembered fainting during a baptism in the winter. These brittle recollections were now presented as if they could provide an explanation for what had transpired. However, no one knew why she had waited until the holiest of days, or where she may go. A drawer in the Daw family's kitchen had been left open a little. There was no paring knife in it. The chef, an elderly woman with years imprinted into her skin, claimed that Holy Thursday was the last time she had seen it. She couldn't meet anyone's eyes when she said it, and she couldn't explain how it had vanished. The sheriff opened the church by himself that night. He moved toward the altar, passing the fallen pews and the linen smeared with wine. Behind it, he discovered a blood smear between scripture and hymnals that no one had before seen. A single, little cotton glove with dirt between the fingernails was next to it. Rebecca's. There was no question about this. It was the folded slip of paper underneath the glove that cooled the air even more. The fading yet readable words were torn off a ledger corner. When the wine is poured, he touches me. No date, no name, and no signature, only the punishment. A warning, a confession, or possibly both. Without saying anything, the sheriff departed. The glove and the note were gone by dawn. Stolen, lost, or concealed. Without them, conjecture increased. In their dreams, some claimed to have seen Rebecca standing at the pulpit with her hands clean and her lips parted as though she were singing. Others reported seeing her strolling along the riverbank, with her reflection following her for a longer period of time than a shadow should. Nobody was aware of her whereabouts or whether she had actually ever left. The days that followed went by silently and slowly, like a parade of shadows. Her name lay behind every door like dust. Yet, the town did not say it out loud. Without a ceremony, the church closed. No prayers, no hymns, no sermons. The sheriff's office placed a notification. Rebecca, an enslaved woman of unknown age, who is thought to be the William C. Dawes, was murdered. He was last seen on church property. There is a reward. When the Echo paper curled in the moisture, the ink was still wet. It was a calm morning in Ashmore. With their windows closed and their maids forced to wear soft soles, the Daw family remained indoors. Even when her brother came from Charleston, Mrs. Dawes would not discuss the issue. No one questioned her about what she meant when she said, "There is more than you think." Once proud of his preaching, the local pastor fell silent. He didn't provide a Sunday service or an explanation, and when elders questioned him, he just said that something outside of his control had touched the church. He didn't go into detail. His wife discovered him burning a stack of letters in the hearth that week. They were written by a lady. He gave her a name she had never heard before in response to the question of whose. The fields whispered at night. People who worked them during the day reported seeing dim lights in the cypress trees. A 10-year-old boy said he heard a woman humming a wordless tune close to the old well. After hitting him for lying, his mother lighted a candle that she didn't put out till dawn. No one disclosed any information. No sighting was reported by the traveler, with the exception of one who reported that a fisherman had spotted a woman crossing the marsh barefoot, her dress trailing in the waves. The sheriff's men who had been dispatched along the river path and into neighboring counties returned empty-handed. When asked, however, the fisherman flatly disputed the story. The following morning, the deputy who had talked to him quit, leaving his badge on the steps of the church. When there was no proof, mistrust shifted inward. Rumors of collusion. Who had observed what? Who had aided her in getting away? The old cook was suspected by some. Others cited the stable worker, who disappeared 2 days later, although debts owed in another county were cited as the reason for his absence. Nothing remained. The reality turned into an ambiguous lattice. Nevertheless, a presence persisted. Windless doors that creaked open, the sound of water flowing where none did, the sensation that something incomplete lingered in the pauses between breaths, as many have described, but no one has identified. Although no one had gone inside, a candle was discovered burning inside the church on the 6th night. Near the pew where Rebecca used to kneel, it burnt low. A complete circle formed as the wax melted. Nobody said they had put it there. Nobody had the courage to take it down, and her name was still not said. The tales continued, like folded notes. They multiplied in whispered voices that were exchanged between hands. Youngsters were cautioned about wandering close to the church. Unintentionally, grown men crossed themselves, and amid the cabins, by faint lanterns and dwindling firelight, the elders started talking about Rebecca, not accusingly, but in bits and pieces, as though recounting an old story. According to one, she was born on a night when the frogs were silent and the marsh cooked under a red moon. Another recalled her mother, a woman with eyes that could see through walls and a dialect. No one understood. Before Rebecca learned to walk, she had passed away. From anguish, some said, and from fever, others. She was never genuinely known by anyone. Obsessed by time and memory, an elderly man named Elias remembered Rebecca as a girl who hardly ever wept, who wandered barefoot in the snow, and who stood motionless for so long that the birds forgot she was there. He recalled witnessing her raise her hands in the middle of a storm, palms toward the sky, the rain halting just above her fingers. Others whispered of the night before Easter, and Elias simply smiled, vague and toothless, when asked why he had never mentioned this. Some things aren't meant to be believed out loud. Rebecca was speaking into the reeds near the river, according to a neighbor's daughter. According to a servant from a different home, she discovered chicken bones buried in the churchyard, set up in a circle. Long after the chapel was locked, a stable boy claimed to have heard a low, unknown female voice singing from the rafters. Nobody concurred. Nobody objected. Legend was created by the note discovered behind the altar. There were reportedly multiple sentences in it. Some said it had a list of names on it. There was a question at the conclusion, according to others. Are they going to notice? Are they going to stop? Are they going to pay? Its memory grew, but the paper was gone. The sheriff who had earlier held it pulled away from the crowd. He stopped shaving. He simply stopped talking. Even as the sun shone, his lamp continued to burn. He went into the swamp one morning and never came back. It was said that Mrs. Dawes had lost her mind. She recited scripture backwards while pacing the house. She did not respond when asked who she knew, but one of her roommates said she was seen staring at a closed cupboard and whispering, "She knew. She always knew." The buzzing was something no one could describe. On the 8th night, it started. Low, tenacious, never quite a melody, but definitely human. It came from everywhere and in no direction. It was initially written off as a breeze, a creaking board, or an animal's distant cry, but it persisted through the silence, the prayers, and the sleep, and those who heard it would awaken having a taste of iron on their tongues. Nobody had inquired about her death by that point. The query had evolved. She had left that place behind. She had waited so long because of that. After the feast, time seemed to move in an odd way. It became elastic, abruptly extending and reversing. The days blended together. Behind clouds that would not lift, the sun dawned either late or not at all. Once resonating with work, the fields now whispered only of absence. Crops began to tilt in previously unheard-of directions. The breeze never arrived, but the air grew heavier. A child from the outskirts of town wandered inside the chapel at dawn on the 10th day. Nobody was aware of how he got away, or how he located the key that dangled behind the door of a clergyman. He was kneeling before the altar with his hands clasped and his face white when they discovered him. He mentioned a white-clad woman who was observing him from the third pew. She smiled, he said, but remained still. Her smile, he observed, was unkind. That was the last he would say. Once again, the church was sealed. A farmer digging along a week later. The edge of the swamp discovered a hidden object beneath the dark sea. The ripped and tangled cloth was stuck on a cypress's roots. It had no flesh or bones, only a tarnished brooch with wings spread out like a bird. Mrs. Dawes, who wore it solely on Sundays, had owned it. She denied ever possessing such a thing when asked. Her voice was still and her eyes were hollow. The entire buzzing came back. Now it arrived. From wells that have long dried, from behind shutters that are shuttered, and from under the floors. Men who had been self-assured in their power stopped looking at each other. Spoken codes by elders. No one responded to the letters. The town waited for something it was unable to express. Then she appeared out of nowhere. Across the river, under a crooked tree, a girl collecting firewood said she caught a glimpse of her. Her dress was drenched. A widow claimed to have seen Rebecca carrying a basket and looking as confident as if no time had gone when she passed her on the way to Mill Creek. Unaware of the event, an out-of-state visitor recounted encountering Rebecca, a quiet woman, close to the ferry station and asking for directions west. None of these sightings were genuinely questioned, but none could be confirmed either. The river started to rise, although it was due to a deeper surge rather than rain. Trees leaned toward the current as though trying to get away, banks bled, and roots parted. The pastor eventually spoke at night when the land itself appeared to breathe. In a faltering speech, he acknowledged that there had been more to the feast, that something had been promised and demanded of him, and that the price had been decided long before the sword was drawn. Weary and failing, he called forth the few, who still supported the church. No one offered him consolation as he sobbed. 2 days later, he passed away with his hands crossed as if in submission and his eyes wide. Once sealed, the church door swung open. Everything was in order one morning. Only the pulpit had a change. A message carved with a steady, non-sharp object, while the linens and candles were pressed and trimmed. You never had me. The church was shut down once more, but it hasn't been locked since.